Okay, so I've been looking forward to this build all month. We've got one of the cleanest small form factor cases I've seen, micro ATX board, i5 13600K, plus we'll be using the new RTX 4080 Super, which it's supposed to give us that same performance that we have in the original 4080, but $200 cheaper. Plus, it's got an all black aesthetic that I think looks really good. Anyways, let's put all this together and actually see how it performs. First up, let's take a look at the new 4080 Super. Compared to the original 4080, we've got some very slight increases to the core count, clock speeds, and memory bandwidth. But of course, the biggest difference here is that price. $200 cheaper, which I think we can all agree is a very welcome adjustment. A lot of people felt like the 4080 was overpriced from the beginning, so it's going to make it a bit more feasible to pick it up, and we're also seeing the 7900 XTX lowering their prices to compete. From my testing on a 14900K test bench, this is translating into some small increases in performance across the games I tested. Taking a look at pure rasterization performance, so that's without any upscaling, frame generation, or ray tracing, and yeah, Nvidia's claim of 2 to 5% increase in performance over the last year's 4080 is pretty spot on in my testing. We really weren't expecting massive gains here, and that seems to be the case in Forza Horizon 5, where I'm seeing only around a 2.5% increase in frame rate. It's also around a 21% increase compared to the 4070 Ti Super that just launched last week for $800, which is pretty consistent to what I'm seeing across the other games I've tested. A range of 15 to 25% increase in performance for 25% more cash from the 4070 Ti Super. Both cards can play 4K 60 pretty easily. That increase in performance on the 4080 Super does get you a more comfortable 4K 120 experience. So not a huge increase from the original 4080 to the Super. Now, obviously this card is not aimed at current 4080 owners. I think it's to entice 3000 and 2000 series owners to finally make the upgrade. And that's where you can actually see some pretty massive gains from the previous generation. When you look at it in comparison to the 3080, there is a pretty big uplift in performance. To be clear, I still think that the 3080 has held up really well this generation, but still a 60% increase is not a bad generational improvement, especially if you're wanting a comfortable 4K 120 experience that the 4080 Super will be able to deliver. Now, even with the price reduction, we're obviously still not at the $700 MSRP that the 3080 launched with, but to be fair, we really didn't see many of those cards at that MSRP anyway. In addition to the faster gaming performance, you also get the exclusive features like frame generation that insert AI generated frames in between natively rendered ones, which basically results in a very noticeable improvement to motion smoothness. Now, I don't think that this is a good fit for competitive shooters, as it will put you at a disadvantage with its slight increase in latency, but for single player games like Alan Wake 2, the additional latency is so negligible, you really don't notice it at all. And it makes the insanely high fidelity settings more viable for 4K. Take a look at the lighting and reflection differences between the maxed out ray tracing settings with path tracing on versus off. The entire game world just looks so much more realistic, but it also takes a massive hit in performance even using DLSS. We're still getting a respectable 50 to 60 frames per second, but enabling frame generation, we're easily able to hit 75 to 80, which is a much smoother experience. Okay, so let's take this out of the test bench and see how the card performs in a more realistic scenario. Not much has changed as far as the physical dimensions, and the look of the Super from the original 4080 is pretty much identical. It's still the same blow-through style cooler, but now it's completely blacked out, which I'd have to admit looks pretty sick. The Founders Edition cards are also some of the smallest that you can get, so they're compact enough to fit into a case that can be carried in a backpack to a friend's house or LAN parties, but with that, you're also probably going to need to bring some other things like a portable monitor or an iPad along with your phone and anything else, which means that you need to lug around multiple chargers. However, with the chargers from this video sponsor Ugreen, you could have just a single charger that can power up multiple devices at once. So Ugreen, they sent over a couple of small but pretty powerful little chargers to replace my older ones with these Nexode Pros. They're compatible with all your modern phones, laptops, or tablets, and they support various charger protocols, giving them all a fast charge while taking up a lot less space in my bag. The Nexode 100 watt charger is designed to charge up to 3 devices at the same time. It has 2 USB-C ports and a single USB-A so that it can accommodate everything from Windows handhelds to a MacBook Pro, providing 100 watts of dedicated charging to a single port with the ability to charge a MacBook Pro 14 from 0 to 86% in just 60 minutes. If you want to charge even more, Ugreen also has these Nexode 160 watt chargers that can power up to 4 devices at once with a single port output up to 140 watts. All of these chargers also keep your devices safe with their thermal guard system, which monitors change in real time so that it can distribute appropriate current to each of your devices, so that it will provide a full and fast charge but without damaging the battery. And so if you're interested in checking out some of these Ugreen Nexode chargers, I'll leave a link in the description. With the same dimensions, the Founders card should fit nicely into this case I'm building with today. Speaking of which, I'm using the Z18 from the company called Kuj or Kuje. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce it, but they have some of the cleanest designs I have seen. For starters, you have the outer cover here that's a single piece that slides off from the top. It's made of a 4mm thick aluminum, although there's not a ton of ventilation in this piece. You have some hole punching on the front, side, and rear, but it seems that they're hoping to get the majority of the fresh air from the top and the bottom. Both those areas have mounts for a couple of 120mm fans or a 240mm radiator, so I'm interested to see how that works out for airflow. There's a built-in cover for the power supply to hide the unit itself and keep the finished build looking tidy, which I think it's pretty interesting. There's also a cage to mount a few hard drives if you needed it. So yeah, for a case that's on the slightly larger side of small form factor, which is typically considered anything under 20 liters, this is looking like a promising micro ATX option, as long as you don't mind spending a little extra on an SFX power supply. But we'll have to see how thermals look once we get some hardware installed. Starting with the CPU, I'm gonna be using the i5-13600K. 14 cores, 6 of which are performance cores, and it can boost up to 5.1 GHz. This is still one of the better options out there, especially on the Intel side. The AMD 7800X3D is technically the fastest gaming CPU that you can get at the moment, but the gains compared to the 13600K are gonna be negligible in most games, especially in 4K, which is our target here. Now, the 14th gen 14600K is available as well, and isn't too much more than this new. However, performance differences between the two are so minor, and I don't think that there's any reason to upgrade to it when the 13600K is still fast enough for today's GPUs. For the board I'll be plugging this into, I'm going with the Asus TUF B760M. This being a B series motherboard is more mid-range and not gonna be as pricey as those Z series boards. This also won't allow for overclocking. How important that is will be up to you, but for me, I'm pretty happy with the performance of the 13600K at stock. There's also a DDR4 version of this board if you are wanting to save a bit of money on RAM, and otherwise, this has everything you're gonna need for a gaming build. We've got some overbuilt VRM heat sinks on the front, along with plenty of fan headers across the bottom that we will be taking advantage of. A Thunderbolt USB 4 header that's really nice to see, built-in Wi-Fi 6, and plenty of USB on the back. Now for memory, I'm going with a DDR5 5600 kit from Corsair. It's not the fastest that money can buy, but it's certainly plenty fast for this use case with an XMP profile so that we can easily overclock it. Now we do also have enough room at the top for a 240mm radiator, so I decided to install the NZXT Kraken 240 Elite, one of my favorite options at the moment. Good cooling performance, one of the easier to set up, and I like the version without RGB fans so that there's a lot less cables to manage. And there's only a single cable that is used to connect the pump and fans to power and USB. There's also a super bright and clear 2.3-inch LCD display that we're gonna be able to appreciate through that glass side panel where we can display temps, images, or really anything else that you would want. Now for case fans, there's room for those two 120s at the bottom. I was originally gonna put standard width fans, but they are so tight up against that GPU, and I didn't want the GPU fan to rub, so I actually decided to swap those out for a couple of slims from Noctua. And finally, we also have room for a single 92mm fan at the rear. I'll also be using the Corsair SF750, one of the best SFX power supplies that you can get right now. And seeing how this case cannot fit an ATX power supply, this one is a very good option. So the case has this cover that you install right onto the unit before mounting it to the front. I definitely think it makes the build look just a bit cleaner. And last thing to do here is to drop in our 4080 Super. We're able to fit a GPU up to 328mm in length, which will be a nice fit for our Founders card at 320mm. Now the GPU height is the limitation here at 158mm, so we will need to use a Corsair 12-volt high power bridge in order to get our cover back on. Right, with everything hooked up, let's take a look at what some real-world thermal performance might look like. Jumping into a few rounds of the finals, and look, I was genuinely surprised here. After seeing how few ventilation holes there are in this outer cover, I was worried that this thing would just be an oven. But with those slim fans at the bottom, we really are getting some very decent GPU temps. After an hour of playing the finals, I've only seen it max out at 60 degrees Celsius on the GPU and largely stay in the mid to high 50s. The NZXT Kraken is also keeping the 13600K cool in the mid 70s, only spiking up to 80 degrees every now and then. Now, similar thermal performance in Call of Duty Warzone 2, around 100 frames per second in native 4K, highest settings without any upscaling, and we are getting 60 degrees Celsius on the GPU and mid 60s on the CPU with an ambient room temperature of 24 degrees Celsius. We're also seeing some pretty reasonable noise levels using the performance preset in NZXT Cam at around 45 decibels. Now, as for rendering performance, the 4080 Super is about twice as fast as my 3080 when rendering this scene I created in Blender. with the 4080 taking about 1.5 minutes where my 3080 took closer to 4. So if you're working with more complex scenes and animations, that timing difference would definitely add up. Anyway, over the course of the next few weeks, I'm going to be testing out this GPU a lot more in other productivity tasks like working in DaVinci, more Blender, and I'm also really keen to check out the new RTX Remix software. In the end, just like the original 4080, the 4080 Super is a big jump from the previous generation, but it's essentially the same performance as the current 4080, just $200 cheaper, which I think is really the whole point of this release. It's just a price adjustment. It's here to entice anyone still holding onto their 20 or 30 series GPUs to make that upgrade. Anyway, let me know what you guys think. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.